"You don't belong in this room," the woman said loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear, and the sentence sliced through the music like a sudden record scratch. Ava Monroe paused mid-step beneath the golden chandeliers of the Caldwell Foundation Charity Gala in Manhattan, where crystal glasses glittered and billion-dollar deals were often whispered between sips of vintage wine around her tuxedos, and designer gowns moved through the grand hall like a carefully choreographed dance. Yet the sudden silence spreading across the marble floor made it clear that the evening had just changed. Ava stood perfectly still, holding a slim glass of sparkling water, her white evening dress simple, elegant, and deliberately understated, a quiet contrast to the glittering display surrounding her. She had walked into the gala alone, no entourage, no flashing cameras, no assistant whispering introductions, which was exactly how she preferred it. Anonymity was useful, especially on nights like this when everyone else seemed too busy measuring status to notice the quiet observers in the room. But the woman confronting her certainly noticed. Tall blonde, draped in a crimson gown that shimmered under the ballroom lights, Victoria Caldwell carried herself with the relaxed certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether she belonged anywhere. The daughter of old money and the younger sister of Daniel Caldwell, the billionaire tech investor hosting tonight's event, she tilted her head, slowly studying Ava as if examining a puzzle piece that had somehow fallen into the wrong box. "I asked who invited you," Victoria continued, her voice smooth but sharpened by public confidence, "because this section is reserved for partners, donors, and people who actually belong here." A ripple of whispers moved through the nearby guests like wind passing through tall grass. Some people glanced away, pretending not to watch, while others leaned closer, curiosity sharpening their attention. Ava met Victoria's gaze without raising her voice or shifting her posture. The calm in her eyes was not confusion, and it certainly was not fear. It was patience, the kind built from years of walking into rooms where assumptions arrive before introductions. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Ava replied softly, and the quiet steadiness of her tone seemed almost louder than Victoria's accusation. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Ethan Park lifted his phone, slightly sensing the fragile electricity in the air. He had come to the gala hoping to catch a quote from Daniel Caldwell about his company's rumored expansion deal. But suddenly the real story seemed to be unfolding 10 feet away from the champagne tower. Victoria noticed the phones appearing around the edges of the crowd, and her smile tightened just slightly, as if the room's attention only encouraged her performance. "You know," she said, reaching for a glass of deep red Bordeaux from a passing server, "some people try very hard to look like they belong in places built for a different level of society." She swirled the wine slowly, watching the dark liquid circle the crystal glass, as if the motion itself was part of the conversation, and the surrounding guests held their breath, waiting to see whether Ava would react. But Ava remained composed, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable. Somewhere behind Victoria, the ballroom doors opened briefly, allowing a cool gust of Manhattan night air to slip inside, carrying distant traffic noise from Fifth Avenue. The sound reminded Ava of something familiar, the rhythm of a city that never paused for anyone who hesitated, and she had learned long ago never to hesitate. Victoria lifted the wine glass slightly closer, studying Ava one last time, as though searching for a reaction she could use as proof of superiority. Instead, she found only calm, which irritated her more than any argument ever. "Could you really should leave," Victoria added, "because my brother Daniel is announcing something very important tonight, and we prefer not to have distractions." The words hung in the air like a final warning, but Ava simply glanced toward the far end of the ballroom, where a large screen displayed the Caldwell global logo glowing above the stage. She knew exactly what announcement Victoria meant: a $2.4 billion partnership expansion deal, the kind of agreement that could reshape industries or quietly collapse, depending on a single signature. Ava turned back to Victoria and offered the faintest hint of a smile. "You're right," she said softly, "tonight is very important." The reply seemed simple, yet something in the way she said it caused Ethan Park to lean forward, slightly adjusting his camera angle, because the tone carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood consequences better than anyone else in the room. Victoria, however, mistook the calm for surrender and lifted her glass again, the dark wine catching the chandelier light like liquid ruby before the room even realized what she intended to do. Ava's phone vibrated quietly inside her clutch, a message from Naomi Brooks, her executive assistant back at Monroe Group headquarters 20 blocks away. The screen showed only 4 words: documents ready awaiting signal. Ava glanced down briefly, then returned her attention to Victoria, just as the ballroom orchestra paused between songs, leaving a fragile silence stretching across the hall. Victoria's smile widened, unaware that the quiet woman standing in front of her already held the power to change everything in the next few minutes. And in that suspended moment, before the next note of music, before the first drop of wine ever left the glass, the entire future of Caldwell Global's biggest deal was quietly hanging on a decision no one in the ballroom realized Ava Monroe had already made, but the room still believed the story belonged to the Caldwell family, to their wealth, their influence, their perfectly choreographed evening. They did not yet understand that the quiet guest they were challenging had built an empire from moments exactly like this, moments when assumptions walked confidently into the wrong room. Ava watched Victoria carefully, not with anger, but with the analytical focus that had guided her through boardrooms, acquisitions, and billion-dollar negotiations. She recognized the familiar pattern of someone who believed power was inherited rather than earned. Across the ballroom, waiters moved slowly, unsure whether to continue serving drinks or pause entirely. Conversations lowered into murmurs as guests sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Ethan Park shifted closer, his journalist instincts quietly alert, because stories rarely announced themselves this clearly, yet the tension in the air felt unmistakable. Victoria, meanwhile, mistook the attention for admiration. She straightened slightly, enjoying the silent audience, and lifted her chin as though delivering a final verdict. Last chance, she said quietly. Leave before security notices you. Ava tilted her head just a fraction, the movement subtle, thoughtful, almost curious, as if considering a question no one else had asked. Then she reached into her clutch and touched the screen of her phone. Naomi, she said softly, when the call connected, her voice barely above the hum of the room. Are the documents prepared? Naomi's answer came instantly, calm, efficient, always ready. They are waiting for your authorization. Ava looked back at Victoria, whose expression remained confident, unaware that the quiet conversation happening only inches away had already begun to shift the balance of power inside the entire room. Ava ended the call, gently sliding the phone back into her clutch. Then she returned her attention fully to Victoria, her calm composure unchanged, the faint smile returning to her lips. You're right, she said again. Tonight is important, more important than anyone here realizes. And for the first time, Victoria noticed something unsettling in Ava's steady gaze. Not anger, not embarrassment, but certainty, the kind that appears only when a decision has already been made somewhere beyond the reach of the room. And though the guests still believed the evening belonged to the Caldwell family, the quiet woman standing in front of them had already decided how the night would end, and none of them yet understood that the most powerful person in the ballroom had walked in alone, without introduction, without applause, and without anyone recognizing her name, until the moment it would change everything. I thought you said security would handle this, Victoria Caldwell said with a small, impatient laugh as she glanced toward the edge of the ballroom, where 2 hotel security staff stood near the entrance, pretending not to notice the tension forming around the champagne tower. Yet the room had already shifted, the quiet murmurs spreading like invisible waves between the round tables and velvet chairs. Ava Monroe stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, calm, composed, and completely unmoved by the attention gathering around her. The soft hum of the orchestra returning as musicians cautiously resumed playing a slow jazz arrangement that drifted through the ballroom like a careful attempt to restore normalcy. But normal had already slipped out of the room, and everyone could feel it, even if they pretended otherwise. Victoria took a slow sip from her wine glass, her eyes never leaving Ava, as though she expected the woman in front of her to finally break character, apologize, or retreat quietly toward the exit. But Ava did none of those things. Instead, she watched the room the way experienced executives observe a boardroom, reading expressions, calculating reactions, measuring silence. The ballroom inside the Waldorf Astoria stretched wide beneath vaulted ceilings glowing with warm amber light, crystal chandeliers scattering reflections across polished marble floors and silk tablecloths. The Caldwell Foundation logo glowed softly on the digital screen above the stage, waiting for Daniel Caldwell to begin his announcement about the expansion deal, the same deal that had drawn investors, journalists, and corporate partners from across the country. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the future of Caldwell Global, a future built on a $2.4 billion partnership agreement that investors had been whispering about for weeks. But the future of that deal now stood quietly holding a glass of water in the middle of the room, wearing a white dress that still carried the faint stain of red wine across the fabric like a subtle reminder of how quickly assumptions could stain reputations. Ethan Park adjusted his phone again, his instincts telling him something bigger than social embarrassment was unfolding. He had spent 3 years covering corporate events for a financial news outlet, and he had learned that the most important stories rarely began on stage. They began in the small moments where powerful people made careless decisions. The camera lens captured Ava from the side, her posture straight, her gaze steady, her calm presence strangely commanding, even though she had not raised her voice once. Victoria, meanwhile, mistook that calm for stubborn defiance. She set her empty glass on a passing tray and folded her arms across her chest, clearly enjoying the attention that the confrontation had drawn around them. "You really do not understand how this works," she said, her voice confident enough that several nearby guests turned their chairs slightly to listen. "This is not some open networking event. People come here because they have influence, they have connections, they have business with my brother." The words carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to speaking for the room, but Ava's expression did not change. She simply tilted her head, slightly studying Victoria, as though the woman were explaining a system Ava had already mastered years earlier. "Influence is an interesting word," Ava said quietly. "It often sounds powerful until you realize how fragile it can be." Victoria frowned slightly, the response clearly not the reaction she expected, because people who believe they control the room rarely consider the possibility that someone else already controls the outcome. Across the ballroom, a group of investors whispered among themselves. One of them, an older venture capitalist named Leonard Grayson, leaned toward his colleague and said softly, "I have seen that woman before, but I cannot place where." The colleague shook his head, studying Ava carefully. "Something about the way she carries herself looks familiar, like she has walked into boardrooms bigger than this." The whispers traveled quietly from table to table, curiosity spreading faster than the music could cover it, and Victoria noticed the shifting attention. She straightened her posture, slightly realizing that the narrative she intended to control was beginning to slip into uncertainty. "Security should already be here," she muttered under her breath, glancing toward the entrance again. But the security staff remained still, exchanging uncertain looks because no one had given them clear instructions, and no one wanted to escalate a scene involving the Caldwell family, unless Daniel Caldwell himself made the call. Ava noticed the hesitation immediately. She had spent years watching how people behaved when authority became unclear. Hesitation always appeared first, then doubt, then silence. The pattern repeated itself in corporations, governments, and social circles alike. The only difference was how long it took for someone to recognize it. Victoria finally exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "You know what," she said, raising her voice just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I am going to make this very simple." She stepped slightly closer, lowering her tone again, but keeping it firm. "You are embarrassing yourself. Leave before my brother arrives, because he will not be as polite as I have been." The statement carried the weight of a warning, but Ava's reaction was nothing like fear. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the large digital screen above the stage, where the Caldwell global presentation slide waited, glowing blue against the dark background. Then she returned her attention to Victoria and offered a small, thoughtful nod. "Your brother will arrive soon," Ava said, "and when he does, this evening will become very memorable." Victoria blinked once, clearly unsure whether the comment was sarcasm or compliance, and for a moment the silence between them stretched long enough for the surrounding guests to sense that something unusual had just been said. Ethan Park leaned closer, capturing the moment on video, because the tone of Ava's voice had shifted slightly, not louder, not aggressive, but certain, the kind of certainty that people only speak with when the outcome of a situation is already decided somewhere beyond the room. Victoria, however, heard only challenge. Her patience snapped. She turned to a nearby event coordinator standing near the stage and gestured sharply. "Could someone please find security?" she said loudly. This woman clearly wandered into the wrong event. The coordinator hesitated, glancing between Victoria and Ava, unsure which person in the confrontation actually held the greater authority, because Ava's calm composure suggested a level of confidence that did not match the accusation being made, and that uncertainty spread like a quiet ripple through the room. Ava noticed it immediately. She had built an entire career understanding moments like this, moments when perception began to fracture under the weight of new information. The orchestra finished another slow melody, and paused again, leaving the ballroom wrapped in a softer, quieter silence. Ava reached into her clutch, once more her phone lighting briefly, as another message appeared from Naomi Brooks. The text contained only 2 words: confirmation, ready. Ava read the message, then slipped the phone back into her clutch without urgency, the movement small, deliberate, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention. Victoria crossed her arms again, clearly determined to end the interaction before the attention around them grew further. "You are still standing here," she said with a tight smile. "Which means you have not understood my request." Ava met her gaze calmly. "I understood it perfectly," she replied. "The question is whether you understood what you just did." Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head in disbelief, because in her mind the situation was still simple: an uninvited guest refusing to leave a private event. But in Ava's mind the moment had already moved several steps beyond that. The decisions had already been made, the consequences already set in motion. Across the ballroom, Leonard Grayson suddenly leaned forward, squinting toward Ava's face again. "Wait," he whispered to his colleague. "Monroe, that name just crossed my mind." The colleague frowned. "Monroe, as in Monroe Group, the logistics and infrastructure company that has been dominating international expansion deals for the last 5 years." Leonard slowly nodded, still studying Ava's face. "I saw her speak at a global investment summit 2 years ago." The calm, the posture, the way she stands when everyone else is talking. The colleague's eyes widened slightly as the realization began to form, but before either man could say another word, the ballroom lights dimmed, slightly signaling that Daniel Caldwell was about to step onto the stage. And the entire room turned toward the front, unaware that the most important decision of the night had already been made long before the presentation even began, and the quiet woman standing near the champagne tower had been waiting patiently for the moment when everyone else finally realized whose night it actually was. The ballroom lights dimmed slowly, and the low hum of conversation softened as a spotlight warmed the stage at the far end of the room, where the Caldwell Global logo glowed across a massive screen. Daniel Caldwell stepped into the light with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent the last decade becoming one of the most recognized figures in American technology investment. Tall, sharp, in a tailored black tuxedo, he raised one hand toward the audience, and the room answered with polite applause. Glasses clinked softly against tables as guests turned their chairs toward the stage, eager to hear about the expansion announcement that had drawn half the financial press in Manhattan into one room tonight. Daniel smiled, the practiced smile of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom speakers. "Thank you for being here tonight to support the Caldwell Foundation and to celebrate a moment that I believe will shape the next decade of innovation for our company." The applause grew louder, and Daniel nodded, graciously pausing just long enough to let the energy settle before continuing. "Over the last year, we have been working on an extraordinary partnership that will allow Caldwell Global to expand infrastructure and technology networks across multiple international markets. This agreement represents more than investment. It represents the future of connectivity across continents." Ethan Park slowly adjusted the angle of his phone, capturing the speech while still keeping Ava Monroe within the frame, because something about the calm woman standing near the champagne tower felt more significant than the presentation unfolding on stage around him. Guests leaned forward, listening carefully, while waiters moved quietly between tables, delivering new glasses of wine and sparkling water. Victoria Caldwell, meanwhile, had stepped a few feet away from Ava, satisfied that the focus of the evening had shifted back to the stage, yet every few seconds her eyes drifted back toward the woman in white, as though the unresolved tension between them refused to disappear. Ava remained exactly where she stood, one hand resting lightly against the rim of the table beside her, her posture relaxed yet attentive, the faint red stain across her dress still visible beneath the ballroom lights. But she did not seem concerned with it. Instead, her attention rested on Daniel Caldwell as he spoke about ambition, opportunity, and expansion, because every word he said now carried a weight he did not yet understand. Daniel continued, "Tonight, I am proud to say that Caldwell Global has secured a strategic partnership valued at $2.4 billion that will allow us to develop the most advanced infrastructure platform our company has ever attempted." The audience responded with a wave of impressed murmurs. Some guests exchanged excited glances, while investors scribbled notes on their phones, because $2.4 billion was not simply an expansion, It was a transformation of scale, the kind of deal that could push a company into an entirely different tier of influence. Daniel raised his hand slightly, inviting the applause to settle again. This partnership represents months of negotiation and careful planning, he continued, and I want to thank the extraordinary team that helped make it possible, our partners at Monroe Group, for believing in the vision of what Caldwell Global can build together. For a moment the room responded with polite clapping. Several guests nodded approvingly, while others whispered quietly about logistics, shipping networks, and global supply chains. But across the ballroom, Leonard Grayson suddenly sat upright. Monroe Group, he repeated under his breath as the name echoed through his memory. His colleague turned quickly. You were right. That woman. Leonard did not finish the sentence immediately, because at that exact moment Ethan Park shifted his camera slightly, revealing Ava Monroe's face in full view under the warm chandelier light. The expression was calm, focused, and strangely reflective, as if she were listening to a presentation that had already reached its conclusion long before the speaker finished. The room, however, still believed the narrative belonged entirely to Daniel Caldwell. Victoria Caldwell smiled proudly near the front of the crowd, clearly pleased with the attention her brother commanded. She lifted a glass of champagne and whispered to a nearby investor, $2.4 billion is only the beginning. Just wait until you see what we announce next year. The investor nodded, impressed, yet across the ballroom Leonard Grayson slowly stood from his chair, his eyes locked on Ava Monroe. As recognition finally crystallized in his mind, wait, he whispered louder. Now, that is her. The colleague beside him blinked in confusion. Who? Leonard lowered his voice, but the urgency remained. Monroe Group's founder, Ava Monroe. She built that company from a logistics startup into one of the largest infrastructure networks in the country. The colleague stared across the room again, studying Ava carefully, the calm posture, the quiet confidence, the way she watched the stage without the slightest trace of surprise. That is impossible, he said. Daniel would never allow someone like that to stand in the corner unrecognized. Leonard shook his head slowly. You do not understand, he replied. She does not need to be recognized to control the room. Meanwhile, Daniel continued speaking on stage, his voice growing more animated as he described the potential of the partnership with Monroe Group. Our shared infrastructure initiative will open new markets from North America to Southeast Asia, he said confidently, and the foundation we lay tonight will influence the next generation of global development. The audience responded with another round of applause, but now the sound carried a subtle uncertainty, because small clusters of guests had begun whispering among themselves. As the realization slowly spread through the room, Ethan Park felt the shift instantly. His instincts sharpened. He zoomed the camera closer toward Ava Monroe, capturing her profile, while Daniel Caldwell continued praising a partnership whose true architect stood silently only 30 feet away. Ava glanced briefly toward the large screen where the Monroe Group logo appeared beside Caldwell Global. Then she looked back toward Daniel Caldwell, and the faintest trace of something thoughtful crossed her expression. Not anger, not resentment, simply the quiet calculation of someone reviewing a negotiation that had reached its final stage. Victoria noticed the change in the room almost immediately, the whispers, the curious glances turning toward Ava. She frowned, slightly confused. Why are people looking over there? She murmured to the investor beside her, but the investor did not answer. His attention had shifted across the ballroom, following the same line of realization that Leonard Grayson had just spoken aloud. Ethan Park took a small step closer, still filming, because the energy in the room had changed completely. The kind of shift journalists waited years to witness. Daniel Caldwell, however, remained unaware. On stage, he gestured toward the massive digital screen where architectural renderings of future infrastructure projects illuminated the ballroom in bright blue light. These developments represent the most ambitious expansion Caldwell Global has ever attempted, he said proudly, and I am honored to announce that the final agreements with Monroe Group will be signed later tonight. The room fell into a softer silence as guests processed the scale of what they were hearing, because signing the agreement tonight meant that the partnership was still technically unfinished, still dependent on the final approval of both companies. Across the ballroom, Ava Monroe slowly lifted her glass of sparkling water and took a calm, measured sip, her eyes never leaving the stage. The orchestra behind the audience had stopped playing entirely, now sensing that the room's attention belonged somewhere else entirely. Leonard Grayson stepped away from his table and moved quietly through the crowd until he stood only a few feet from Ava Monroe. He studied her carefully before speaking. Miss Monroe, he said respectfully, his voice low, but unmistakably certain. Ava turned toward him with polite curiosity, and Leonard nodded slightly, confirming what he already knew. I thought I recognized you. The room around them seemed to inhale all at once, because the simple acknowledgement carried a truth that dozens of guests had begun suspecting. Victoria Caldwell turned sharply toward the sound of Leonard's voice, and her confident expression faltered as she followed his gaze across the ballroom toward the woman she had dismissed only minutes earlier. Ava Monroe met Leonard's nod with a small, composed smile, and in that quiet moment, while Daniel Caldwell continued celebrating a partnership he believed already secure, the realization spread through the ballroom like a slow rising tide. The most powerful person connected to the $2.4 billion agreement was not standing on stage under the spotlight. She was standing quietly beside the champagne tower, listening patiently to a speech that no longer belonged to the man delivering it. And for the first time that evening, the room began to understand that the balance of power inside the Waldorf Astoria ballroom had shifted completely, without a single raised voice. The applause that followed Daniel Caldwell's announcement faded slowly across the ballroom, like the final echo of a song that no longer fit the moment. He stood confidently beneath the spotlight, unaware that the energy in the room had changed in a way that no presentation slide could recover. Investors still faced the stage, but their eyes drifted elsewhere, toward the quiet woman standing near the champagne tower. Ava Monroe remained calm, her glass resting lightly between her fingers, as if she were simply another guest listening politely to a corporate speech. Yet the small circle of recognition forming around her had already begun to ripple outward. Leonard Grayson stood beside her now, his posture respectful, his voice low enough to avoid interrupting the presentation, yet clear enough that several nearby guests heard every word. Miss Monroe, he repeated softly, it is an honor to finally meet you in person. Ava acknowledged him with a small nod, the gesture calm and composed, as if this moment were far less surprising to her than it was to the people gathering around them. Leonard glanced briefly toward the stage, where Daniel Caldwell continued describing market forecasts and expansion strategies. Then he leaned closer and said quietly, I do not believe Daniel realizes you are here. Ava's response carried the same quiet steadiness that had defined her presence since she entered the ballroom. He will soon. Leonard studied her expression, carefully noticing that she did not appear offended or angry, only patient, the kind of patience that often appears when someone understands a situation far better than anyone else in the room. Across the ballroom, Ethan Park slowly stepped closer, his camera still recording the unfolding moment because the tension had shifted away from the stage entirely. Daniel Caldwell's voice continued through the speakers, describing international logistics corridors and infrastructure timelines, but the audience now listened with divided attention as more people began noticing the cluster forming near the champagne tower. Whispers spread through the ballroom like wind passing through tall grass. Monroe Group, someone murmured. That is Ava Monroe. Another guest leaned toward his colleague and said, the founder, the one who built the company from that small transportation network out of Chicago. Victoria Caldwell noticed the shift almost immediately. She had been smiling confidently near the front of the stage, enjoying the admiration surrounding her brother's speech, but the growing whispers behind her began to disrupt the narrative she believed she controlled. She turned slightly, scanning the room, until her eyes followed the same line of attention as everyone else, and landed on Ava Monroe standing calmly in the center of the gathering. Victoria's expression tightened in confusion. She stepped away from the front row and began moving through the crowd, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she approached the small circle of investors surrounding Ava. Leonard Grayson noticed Victoria's approach and stepped slightly aside, allowing her a clear view of the woman she had confronted earlier. Victoria stopped 2 feet away, studying Ava carefully, the confidence in her posture still present, but now touched with uncertainty. You are still here, she said quietly. Ava looked at her with the same calm gaze she had held all evening. Yes. Victoria folded her arms slightly, as if trying to regain the authority she had displayed earlier. This is a private event, Ava answered with a gentle nod. I am aware. Leonard cleared his throat softly, sensing the tension between them. Victoria glanced at him briefly, and then back at Ava, as if trying to assemble a puzzle that refused to fit together around them. The surrounding guests had grown silent, their attention Shifting fully away from the stage where Daniel Caldwell continued speaking enthusiastically about global expansion, he had not yet noticed that half his audience was now watching something far more significant happening across the ballroom. Victoria lowered her voice, leaning slightly closer to Ava. I believe there has been some misunderstanding about the nature of this event. Ava studied her expression thoughtfully. Misunderstanding is an interesting word. Victoria hesitated the earlier confidence she carried now competing with the realization that the room's attention had turned against her narrative. She glanced around, noticing the curious faces, the phones quietly recording the whispers that carried fragments of recognition. Leonard Grayson finally spoke. Miss Caldwell, you may want to know that you are speaking to Ava Monroe. Victoria blinked once, the name landing with the weight of sudden gravity. For a brief moment, she said nothing, her eyes returning to Ava's face as if searching for confirmation. Ava did not rush to fill the silence. She simply held Victoria's gaze, the same calm composure intact. The realization spread through the surrounding crowd. Almost instantly, a few guests inhaled softly, others exchanged glances that carried both surprise and disbelief. Victoria's voice dropped another level. That is not possible. Ava tilted her head slightly. Why not? Victoria's mind raced, assembling the pieces, the calm posture, the quiet confidence, the lack of reaction earlier, the faint stain of wine across the white dress, and suddenly the memory of their confrontation replayed in her thoughts with a different meaning entirely. Across the ballroom, Daniel Caldwell finally paused his speech, noticing the unusual silence spreading through the audience. He glanced across the room, trying to understand why so many guests had turned away from the stage. Ethan Park shifted his camera, capturing both the stage and the gathering around Ava Monroe, because the story he had come to cover had just changed direction completely. Daniel stepped forward, slightly squinting toward the back of the ballroom, his voice lowering as he addressed the crowd. Is everything all right? Someone near the front whispered something to him, but the words did not reach the microphone. Daniel followed the direction of the whisper, and his eyes landed on the group surrounding Ava Monroe. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. He stepped down from the stage, slowly, the room growing quieter with every step he took across the marble floor. Victoria remained standing directly in front of Ava, her expression now caught between disbelief and realization. Daniel approached his sister first. Victoria, what is happening here? Victoria did not answer immediately. She looked at Ava once more, then back at her brother. Daniel's attention shifted toward the woman in white standing beside Leonard Grayson, his brow furrowed as he studied her face. Something about it seemed familiar, but the connection had not yet fully formed. Ava met his gaze with the same composed calm she had carried throughout the evening. Daniel Caldwell stopped 3 feet away from her, the room completely silent. Now Daniel extended a polite smile, the kind he used with unfamiliar guests. Good evening. I do not believe we have met. Ava Monroe offered a small courteous nod. Daniel's expression changed instantly, the name settling into his awareness like a delayed echo. The silence that followed was deeper than anything that had occurred earlier, because now the entire ballroom understood the significance of the moment. Daniel glanced briefly toward the massive screen above the stage where the Monroe Group logo still glowed beside Caldwell Global. Then he looked back at Ava Monroe standing calmly in front of him, the faint stain of red wine still visible against the white fabric of her dress. Victoria shifted slightly beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, I think we may have made a mistake. Daniel did not answer immediately. He studied Ava carefully, the pieces of the evening assembling rapidly in his mind. The quiet guest, his sister, had confronted the calm confidence, the lack of introduction, and the partnership agreement he had just announced to the room. Ava Monroe watched him without accusation or triumph, only quiet certainty, the kind that appears when someone has already reached the end of a negotiation. Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured, careful. Miss Monroe, I was not aware you were attending tonight. Ava gave a slight nod that is understandable. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward the stain on her dress, then back to her eyes, the meaning of that detail settling into his thoughts like the final piece of a difficult equation. Around them, the ballroom remained silent, hundreds of guests now witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the speeches and presentations were forgotten. Ethan Park continued filming, his pulse quickening, because he understood that the most powerful scene of the night had not occurred on stage, but in this quiet circle near the Champagne Tower, where the future of a $2.4 billion partnership now stood balanced on a conversation that had only just begun. Daniel Caldwell did not speak for several seconds, and in a ballroom filled with investors, executives, and journalists, the silence grew heavier than any speech he had given moments earlier. The spotlight above the stage still illuminated the large screen where Caldwell Global and Monroe Group glowed side by side in blue and silver lettering, a partnership announced with confidence only minutes ago. Yet now that same partnership seemed to hover in uncertainty between two people standing 10 feet apart. Ava Monroe remained calm, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly around the glass of sparkling water, as though this moment had always been part of the evening she expected. Daniel finally cleared his throat, the practiced composure of a seasoned executive returning to his voice. "Miss Monroe," he said carefully, "I was not informed that you would be attending tonight." Ava offered a polite nod that was intentional. Daniel's expression tightened just slightly. The words were simple, yet the meaning behind them landed with unmistakable weight. Around them, guests leaned forward, listening intently, the soft rustle of fabric and shifting chairs the only sounds breaking the silence. Victoria Caldwell stood beside her brother, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stiffness. She looked from Daniel to Ava, and then toward the faint stain across the white fabric of Ava's dress, the memory of what had happened less than 15 minutes earlier replaying in her mind. With painful clarity, Daniel noticed the stain, as well as eyes lingering on it for a brief moment before returning to Ava. "I see there has been some kind of incident," he said, the sentence carefully measured. Ava glanced down at the faint red mark across her dress, then back at him, the calm expression never leaving her face. "Yes," she said softly, "there was a brief misunderstanding." Victoria inhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable with the word misunderstanding. Daniel turned toward his sister, his brow narrowing slightly. "Victoria, what happened?" Victoria hesitated, the room watching her closely, now the earlier murmurs replaced by complete attention. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again before answering. "I believed she was not invited." Daniel studied her for a moment, then looked back at Ava Monroe, the founder and chief executive of Monroe Group, the woman whose company controlled the infrastructure partnership he had just celebrated on stage moments earlier, a partnership valued at $2.4 billion. Ava's calm gaze met his without hostility or accusation, yet the quiet certainty behind it spoke louder than any confrontation. Daniel understood immediately that whatever had happened earlier had occurred before anyone realized who she was. He exhaled slowly, then addressed her again. "Miss Monroe, if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, I would like to personally apologize on behalf of the Caldwell Foundation." Ava tilted her head slightly, the gesture thoughtful, almost curious. The word apology carried significance, but it also carried timing, and timing in business often mattered more than the words themselves. Around the ballroom, the crowd remained silent. Ethan Park held his phone steady, capturing every second, because this moment had transformed from social embarrassment into corporate consequence. Ava finally spoke. "Your sister believed I did not belong here." Daniel glanced briefly toward Victoria, whose shoulders had stiffened further. He returned his attention to Ava and asked quietly, "Did she say that?" Ava considered the question for a moment. She spoke clearly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "She said that some people try very hard to look like they belong in places built for a different level of society." The words landed across the room like a slow-moving ripple. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged quiet glances. Daniel's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the recognition of how dangerous such a statement could become in a room filled with investors, partners, and media. Victoria looked down briefly, the weight of the moment pressing against her confidence. Daniel spoke again, this time more firmly. "Victoria, is that accurate?" Victoria hesitated, then nodded once reluctantly. Daniel inhaled deeply, then turned back to Ava. "Miss Monroe, I regret that this occurred at an event hosted by my family." He paused, searching for the correct phrasing. "I assure you that it does not reflect the values of our company." Ava studied him carefully, the calm in her eyes unchanged. "Values are interesting things," she replied quietly. "They often reveal themselves in the moments people think no one important is watching." Leonard Grayson shifted beside her, unable to hide the faint smile that crossed his face, because the sentence carried the kind of precise authority only someone accustomed to negotiating billion-dollar agreements could deliver. Daniel absorbed the remark without protest. He nodded slowly, acknowledging its meaning. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the polished floor as the crowd remained completely still, aware that every word now carried consequences. Daniel glanced toward the large screen Behind him, where Monroe Group's logo remained, displayed beside his company's brand. Then he looked back at Ava Monroe. Miss Monroe, he said carefully, tonight was meant to celebrate a partnership between our companies, one that has taken months of negotiation and preparation. I would like the opportunity to ensure that tonight's misunderstanding does not interfere with the future we have both been building. Ava listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Ethan Park leaned slightly closer, his camera capturing the faint reflection of chandelier light across her face. The journalist understood that this was the moment when the entire direction of the evening could change. Ava finally spoke. The partnership between Monroe Group and Caldwell Global is indeed significant. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. $2.4 billion represents more than numbers, it represents trust. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly, Ava continued, that trust depends on judgment. Daniel remained silent, waiting. Victoria shifted beside him, her hands clasped tightly together as though trying to hold the evening in place. Ava looked briefly around the ballroom at the hundreds of faces watching them, investors, reporters, executives, people who had come expecting a celebration of corporate ambition. Then she returned her gaze to Daniel. Caldwell, your presentation earlier described the future of this partnership, she said calmly. Daniel nodded again. It does. Ava lifted her glass of sparkling water and took a small measured sip before continuing. The future of any partnership depends on understanding the people behind it. The sentence carried no accusation, only quiet clarity. Daniel felt the truth of it immediately, because the situation unfolding in front of the entire ballroom had already become larger than a social misunderstanding. It had become a reflection of leadership, judgment, and respect, the foundation of any agreement between powerful organizations. Daniel straightened slightly. Miss Monroe, I would like to correct tonight's mistake if you will allow it. Ava considered his words carefully, the room so quiet now that the faint clink of glass from a distant table echoed softly through the ballroom. After a moment, she spoke again. I appreciate the offer. Daniel waited, the entire room waiting with him. Ava continued, however, decisions in business cannot be guided by convenience, they must be guided by principle. The sentence settled over the crowd with unmistakable gravity. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Daniel felt the tension tighten across the room. He spoke again, his voice steady but lower. What are you saying? Ava met his gaze calmly. I am saying that tonight has given me important insight into how your organization evaluates the people. It does not recognize. The words were delivered without anger, yet they carried the precision of a final evaluation. Daniel felt the meaning immediately. The partnership he had announced with confidence only minutes earlier now balanced on a single decision. Ava Monroe had the authority to make. The orchestra in the far corner remained silent, the musicians watching the moment unfold along with everyone else. Ethan Park's camera continued recording because he understood that this was no longer simply a story about a social confrontation. It was a story about power, judgment, and the fragile nature of reputation. In rooms where billion-dollar agreements were decided, Ava Monroe lowered her glass slowly, the movement calm, deliberate. Then she spoke again. Daniel Caldwell, earlier tonight you announced to this room that our companies would sign the final agreement before the evening ended. Daniel nodded carefully. That was the plan. Ava's eyes held his steadily. Plans, she said softly, sometimes change when new information appears. And in the silence that followed, every person in the ballroom realized that the future of Caldwell Global's most important deal now rested entirely in the hands of the woman who had walked into the room alone, without introduction, and without anyone recognizing her power until it was almost too late. The silence that followed Ava Monroe's last sentence did not feel temporary. It felt final, like the moment after a door closes and everyone in the room realizes something important has just changed. Daniel Caldwell stood motionless for a second longer, the confident posture he had carried across the stage earlier now replaced by careful calculation, because the woman in front of him had not raised her voice, she had not made a dramatic declaration, she had simply introduced doubt into the foundation of a $2.4 billion agreement. And doubt in business often spread faster than certainty. Around the ballroom, hundreds of guests remained still, investors who had flown from Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, and London, executives who had expected to celebrate the beginning of a global expansion, journalists who had prepared headlines about Caldwell Global's bold new partnership. All of them now watched the quiet conversation unfolding near the Champagne Tower, because the future of the deal Daniel had just announced depended entirely On the decision Ava Monroe had yet to say out loud, Daniel inhaled slowly, then straightened his jacket. Miss Monroe, he said carefully, I hope you understand that the actions of one person do not define an entire organization. Ava regarded him calmly, the faint reflection of chandelier light catching the edge of her glass before she set it down on the table. Beside her, organizations, she replied, are defined by the standards they allow. Daniel nodded, once acknowledging the precision of her answer. He glanced briefly toward Victoria, who stood beside him, visibly uncomfortable. The confidence she had carried earlier now replaced by something closer to disbelief, because only 20 minutes ago she had believed she was correcting an uninvited guest. Now she understood she had challenged the person whose company controlled the most important agreement of the evening. Victoria spoke quietly. Daniel, it did not know Ava turned her attention to her for the first time. Since Daniel had approached, the tone of her voice remained calm. I believe that is the point. Victoria fell silent again, the words carrying a quiet truth that no one in the room could ignore. Ethan Park shifted slightly to maintain a clear camera angle, his instincts telling him that the next few minutes would become the defining moment of the entire story. He had originally come here expecting to document an investment announcement. Now he realized he was witnessing something far more powerful, the moment when leadership, judgment, and personal bias collided in public. Daniel spoke again, his voice steadier. Now, Miss Monroe, our companies have spent months negotiating the framework for this partnership. He gestured toward the large screen where the Monroe Group logo still glowed beside Caldwell Global. We both understand the impact this project could have. Ava followed his gesture briefly, her eyes resting on the illuminated logos before returning to Daniel. Yes, she said quietly, the impact would be significant. Daniel allowed himself a faint hopeful nod. Then perhaps we should focus on the future. Ava considered his words thoughtfully, the room so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning vents echoed softly through the ballroom. Future, she repeated the word slowly, as if examining it. Daniel continued, the infrastructure initiative between our companies could expand transportation networks across 3 continents, create thousands of jobs, and establish a platform for global technology development. Ava listened without interruption, the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening. Surrounding them, investors nodded, subtly agreeing with Daniel's description of the opportunity, because the scale of the partnership truly was enormous. Leonard Grayson folded his arms, thoughtfully studying Ava Monroe's reaction, because he knew from experience that executives who built companies like hers did not make decisions based only on financial projections. Ava finally spoke. Daniel Caldwell, earlier tonight you described the partnership between our companies as a foundation for the next decade of innovation. Daniel nodded. Yes. Ava stepped slightly away from the table, her posture relaxed but deliberate, the faint stain across her white dress still visible under the warm chandelier light. When my team began negotiating with Caldwell Global, she continued, we studied your company carefully, your growth, your strategy, and your leadership. Daniel listened closely, the rest of the ballroom leaning in as well. Ava continued, Monroe Group builds infrastructure that connects industries across continents. She paused, letting the significance settle. We do not simply invest in technology, we invest in judgment. Daniel felt the weight of the word immediately. Judgment. Ava nodded. Yes, because the people who control global networks must demonstrate the ability to recognize value even when it does not arrive in familiar packaging. The sentence carried quiet authority, the room absorbing its meaning. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Daniel remained silent. Ava continued, earlier this evening your sister evaluated my presence in this room based on what she believed someone like me should look like. The words were spoken without accusation, but their meaning reached every corner of the ballroom. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Miss Monroe, I understand your concern. Ava shook her head gently. It is not a concern, she said. It is information. The distinction settled across the room with unmistakable clarity. Ava continued, information that allows me to evaluate the environment in which Monroe Group would place a multi-billion-dollar partnership. Daniel understood immediately. The conversation was no longer about a social misunderstanding. It was about trust, and trust in business could determine the fate of entire industries around them. Several investors exchanged worried glances. Ethan Park continued, filming his camera, capturing the expressions shifting across the crowd. Daniel took a slow breath. Miss Monroe, if tonight has revealed weaknesses in how our organization presents itself, I am willing to address them directly. Ava studied him carefully, And what would addressing them look like? Daniel hesitated, then answered accountability, transparency, and correction. Ava nodded once thoughtful answers. She said Daniel waited the entire room, waiting with him. Ava looked briefly toward the stage, where Daniel had stood only minutes earlier celebrating a partnership he believed already secured. Then she returned her gaze to him and spoke again. When Monroe Group enters a partnership, we evaluate more than balance sheets. We evaluate character. Daniel felt the tension rise across the room. Ava continued, tonight has provided valuable insight into how your organization responds to unfamiliar leadership. Daniel glanced briefly toward the guests surrounding them, many of whom now avoided his eyes because they understood exactly what she meant. Ava folded her hands calmly in front of her. Daniel Caldwell, earlier this evening you asked whether tonight's misunderstanding would interfere with the future our companies were building. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Ava met his gaze steadily. The future of that partnership depends on whether I believe your organization can recognize leadership when it does not fit your expectations. The words landed quietly, yet carried the force of a verdict. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Daniel remained still, absorbing every syllable, because he knew that the decision Ava Monroe was preparing to make would echo far beyond this ballroom. Ethan Park felt the weight of the moment through the lens of his camera, because history often turned not on loud announcements, but on quiet sentences spoken with certainty. Ava Monroe reached into her clutch and removed her phone, the movement simple, deliberate. She glanced briefly at the screen, then back at Daniel Caldwell, the room holding its breath as she prepared to speak again, because everyone present understood that the next words she chose would determine whether the $2.4 billion partnership announced earlier that night would become the beginning of a powerful alliance or the most expensive mistake Caldwell Global had ever made. I learned something important when I was 23 years old, Ava Monroe said quietly, and the words did not sound like a defense or an accusation. They sounded like a memory, the kind that appears only when a moment demands context. The ballroom remained silent, every guest leaning slightly closer, as if the quiet sentence itself had shifted the rhythm of the night. Daniel Caldwell did not interrupt. He simply watched her, understanding that the conversation had moved somewhere deeper than negotiations or corporate strategy. Ava glanced down briefly at the faint red stain across her white dress, then back toward Daniel and Victoria. When I was 23, she continued, I attended my first major investment conference in Chicago. The event was held inside a hotel ballroom, not very different from this one, chandeliers, polished floors, and a room full of people who believed they understood who belonged there. Several guests exchanged glances, recognizing the familiarity of the description. Ava continued, her voice calm, steady, measured, like someone reading from a page she had memorized years ago. I had just started the small logistics company that eventually became Monroe Group. At the time, it was nothing more than a transportation network with 3 trucks, 1 rented warehouse, and a loan that most banks said I would never be able to repay. Ethan Park held his phone perfectly, still capturing every word, because the room had shifted again, the tension of confrontation replaced by something heavier, reflection. Ava continued, I arrived at that conference wearing the best suit I owned. It was not expensive, but it was clean and professional. I remember standing near the back of the room, studying the speakers on stage, listening to people talk about infrastructure, supply chains, and investment strategies. Victoria Caldwell watched her carefully, now no longer defensive, simply uncertain about where the story was leading. Ava's gaze moved briefly across the ballroom, as if seeing that memory layered over the present. One of the event coordinators approached me and politely asked whether I needed help delivering equipment for the presentation. Ava paused for a moment, the silence in the room deep enough that the faint clink of glassware from a distant table echoed softly. I told him I was not delivering equipment. I told him I was attending the conference. Daniel Caldwell lowered his eyes briefly, understanding the direction of the story. Before Ava spoke again, he smiled politely and said that guests normally arrived through a different entrance. Several investors shifted uncomfortably. Ava continued, I asked him which entrance entrepreneurs were supposed to use, because the invitation email did not mention separate doors. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Ava's voice remained calm, not angry, not bitter, simply clear. He looked at me for a moment and said, I am sure you mean well, but the people speaking in this room represent companies that manage billions of dollars. The sentence settled over the ballroom like a familiar echo. Daniel Caldwell's expression tightened slightly, Because the message behind those words was unmistakable, Ava continued, I thanked him for his concern, then I walked into the room. Anyway, Leonard Grayson allowed himself the faintest smile, recognizing the determination in the story. Ava glanced toward the stage where the Caldwell Global logo still glowed beside Monroe Group. Then she returned her attention to Daniel Caldwell. That day, I listened carefully to every presentation, every projection, every prediction about the future of global infrastructure. She paused, her voice steady, and when the conference ended, I went back to my small office in Chicago and began building the company those speakers believed. I could not possibly understand. The ballroom remained silent, the weight of her story settling across the crowd. Ava continued, over the next 15 years, Monroe Group expanded across transportation networks, supply chains, ports, and international logistics corridors. The company those conference organizers assumed did not belong in the room now manages infrastructure partnerships across 3 continents. Daniel Caldwell nodded slowly, because he knew those numbers were not exaggeration. Monroe Group had become one of the most influential logistics networks in the world. Ava folded her hands calmly in front of her. The past has a way of repeating itself, she said softly. Sometimes the rooms change, the chandeliers become brighter, the numbers become larger, but the assumptions remain. Daniel exhaled slowly, the meaning of her words clear to everyone listening. Victoria Caldwell looked down briefly, the earlier confidence that had defined her posture now replaced by quiet reflection. Ava continued, tonight, when your sister decided that I did not belong in this ballroom, she paused, letting the sentence breathe. She reminded me of that conference in Chicago 15 years ago. The room absorbed the statement with absolute silence. Ava looked at Daniel directly. Your company invited Monroe Group to become the infrastructure partner for your expansion initiative. Daniel nodded again. That is correct, Ava continued. And tonight, before anyone recognized my name, I had the opportunity to observe how your organization responds to unfamiliar leadership. Daniel remained still, understanding that the story she had just shared was not merely a memory, it was context, evidence, and evaluation. Ethan Park felt the weight of the moment through the camera lens, because this was no longer simply a disagreement between 2 executives. It was a demonstration of how bias shaped decisions long before contracts were signed. Ava spoke again, her tone calm but unmistakably final. Earlier, you asked whether tonight's misunderstanding would interfere with the future our companies were planning. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Ava looked briefly toward the screen, where the 2 corporate logos still stood side by side, illuminated in blue light. Then she returned her gaze to him. I now have the information I need to answer that question. Daniel felt the tension return across the room, the pause that followed stretching long enough for every guest to feel the significance of what was about to happen. Victoria Caldwell lifted her eyes again, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel did not respond. He kept his attention fixed on Ava Monroe, the woman whose quiet story had just reframed the entire evening. Ava reached into her clutch once more and removed her phone, the screen lighting softly in her hand, the reflection visible to the closest guest. She glanced down at the display, where a message from Naomi Brooks waited with a single-line confirmation pending. Ava looked up again, her gaze steady. Daniel Caldwell, the partnership agreement between Monroe Group and Caldwell Global represents one of the largest infrastructure investments either of our companies has ever considered. Daniel nodded, carefully aware that every person in the ballroom now understood the decision was seconds away. Ava continued, when Monroe Group chooses a partner, we do not only evaluate financial projections, we evaluate leadership judgment. Daniel said nothing. Ava's voice remained calm. Earlier tonight, your sister made a judgment about who belonged in this room. The statement was delivered without anger, yet it carried undeniable finality. The orchestra in the far corner remained silent, the musicians watching like everyone else. Ethan Park's camera captured the moment as Ava Monroe held her phone in her hand and Daniel Caldwell stood waiting for the verdict that would determine whether the $2.4 billion partnership he had celebrated earlier that evening would become the most successful alliance in his company's history, or a lesson that every executive in the ballroom would remember for the rest of their careers. Daniel Caldwell felt the weight of the room settle onto his shoulders as Ava Monroe held the phone calmly in her hand, the glow of the screen faint beneath the chandelier light. Every investor, every journalist, every executive in the ballroom now understood that the future of Caldwell Global's largest expansion deal depended entirely on what the woman standing in front of him would say next. The large screen behind the stage still displayed the logos of both companies side by side. Monroe Group and Caldwell Global illuminated in blue and silver, as if the partnership had already been sealed, yet the atmosphere inside the room told a different story. The orchestra remained silent, the servers paused near the edges of the ballroom, and even the quiet hum of conversation that usually filled events like this had completely disappeared. Ava looked at Daniel Caldwell for a moment longer, the calm confidence in her posture unchanged. Daniel spoke first, his voice steady but lower than before. Miss Monroe, I understand that tonight created an unfortunate situation, and I take full responsibility for addressing it. Ava listened without interruption. Daniel continued, Monroe Group is one of the most respected infrastructure companies in the world, and the partnership we have discussed could reshape transportation networks across 3 continents. I do not want the actions of one moment to erase months of work. Ava nodded, slowly acknowledging his words, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly around the ballroom, observing the faces watching them, investors who had arrived expecting celebration, executives who had prepared speeches about global expansion, reporters whose cameras were now focused entirely on the conversation happening near the Champagne Tower. Ethan Park stood only a few feet away, his phone recording every word, his instincts telling him that this moment would become the headline, not Daniel Caldwell's announcement. Ava finally spoke. Daniel Caldwell, earlier tonight, you asked whether tonight's misunderstanding would interfere with the partnership between our companies. Daniel nodded carefully. Yes. Ava lifted the phone slightly in her hand, the gesture small but unmistakable. When Monroe Group evaluates a partnership, we consider several factors: financial projections, infrastructure capabilities, operational strategy, and leadership judgment. She paused, letting the words settle across the room. Daniel remained silent, listening. Ava continued, your presentation earlier described the future your company hopes to build through our collaboration. Daniel nodded again, because that future would transform Caldwell Global's position in the market. Ava's voice remained calm and precise. However, partnerships of this scale require something more important than ambition. They require trust. The word trust moved through the ballroom like a quiet echo. Daniel felt it immediately. He knew that trust in corporate agreements was not symbolic. It determined access to capital networks and international markets. Ava looked briefly toward Victoria Caldwell, then back to Daniel. Earlier tonight, your sister made a decision about who belonged in this room. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. He did not attempt to interrupt. Ava continued, when that decision was made, neither of you knew who I was. The statement carried no anger, only clarity. Victoria shifted beside her brother, her voice barely audible. Ava, I did not know. Ava met her gaze briefly. I believe that is clear. Victoria fell silent again. Daniel spoke carefully, Miss Monroe, if tonight revealed anything, it revealed a mistake in how quickly assumptions can be made. Ava nodded once. That is true. Daniel continued. Then allow me to correct that mistake. Ava studied him quietly. Daniel added, Monroe Group's leadership deserves the highest level of respect from our organization, and I am prepared to make that clear to everyone in this room. Ava looked at him for several seconds, the room waiting with him. She then asked one question, how? Daniel paused, surprised by the directness of the response. He answered, accountability, transparency, and change. Ava considered the answer thoughtfully. Daniel continued, Caldwell Global can publicly address what happened tonight and ensure that every executive within our organization understands the standards expected when dealing with our partners. Ava remained calm, but her eyes reflected the careful calculation of someone who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements. Before the ballroom continued, watching the silence stretching long enough that several guests shifted slightly in their chairs. Ava then glanced again toward the large digital screen where the Monroe Group logo still glowed beside Caldwell Global. She spoke quietly, earlier this evening you announced that our companies would sign the final agreement tonight. Daniel nodded slowly. That was the plan. Ava looked back at him. Monroe Group does not make decisions based solely on presentations. Daniel understood immediately that the conversation had reached its most important moment. Ethan Park's camera remained steady, the journalist barely breathing, because he knew the next sentence would determine the future of the entire evening. Ava Monroe lowered her phone slightly, then said something that caused several guests to lean forward. Monroe Group has spent the last 6 months preparing for this partnership. Daniel nodded cautiously. Ava continued, during those 6 months, my team conducted a complete evaluation of Caldwell Global's infrastructure capabilities, operational logistics, and leadership culture. Daniel listened closely. Ava's voice remained measured and calm. Earlier tonight, I received the final report from my executive team. Daniel felt the tension in the room increase. Ava glanced briefly at the phone in her hand. The message from Naomi Brooks, still visible on the screen. Confirmation pending. Ava looked up again. Daniel Caldwell. The report concluded that Caldwell Global possesses the technical resources necessary to support the partnership. Daniel allowed himself a small breath of relief, but Ava had not finished. However, she continued. Leadership culture remains the most important variable in any infrastructure alliance. Daniel remained silent. Ava continued. Tonight provided a real-world example of how leadership decisions occur when identity is unknown. The words carried quiet authority. Victoria looked down again. Daniel spoke carefully. Miss Monroe, I assure you that our leadership culture can evolve. Ava considered that statement thoughtfully and then asked another question. Can it evolve quickly enough? Daniel did not answer immediately, because the question carried a meaning that extended far beyond this single evening. The ballroom remained completely still. Ava Monroe lifted her phone again, the screen glowing softly in her hand. She tapped the display once. Naomi Brooks answered immediately through the speaker. Miss Monroe, the documents are ready. Ava spoke calmly. Naomi, hold the authorization for the moment. Naomi replied, understood. The room absorbed the brief exchange with renewed tension. Ava ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. Daniel Caldwell watched her closely because the decision he had feared was now seconds away. Ava Monroe folded her hands calmly in front of her. Daniel Caldwell Monroe Group has built its reputation by choosing partners who demonstrate strong judgment not only in boardrooms, but in unexpected moments. She paused. The room silent. Our partnerships shape infrastructure across continents, which means the leaders we work with must demonstrate the ability to recognize value even when it arrives without introduction. Daniel felt the weight of every word. Ava then spoke the sentence that would determine everything. Monroe Group will make its final decision regarding the partnership tonight, but that decision will depend on whether I believe Caldwell Global truly understands the lesson this evening has provided. The words settled across the ballroom like a suspended verdict. Every guest, every investor, every journalist now realized that the fate of a $2.4 billion agreement would be decided not by financial projections or stage presentations, but by whether Daniel Caldwell could prove in the next few moments that his company deserved the trust it had nearly lost before it even began. The silence inside the ballroom stretched longer than anyone expected, and the tension carried a weight that no speech or presentation could dissolve. Daniel Caldwell stood facing Ava Monroe, while hundreds of eyes watched from every corner of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom. The glowing screen behind him still displaying the partnership announcement that only 20 minutes earlier had felt like a celebration of Caldwell Global's future. Now that same screen seemed almost ironic. Monroe Group and Caldwell Global still side by side, in bright blue lettering as if the deal were already complete, yet every person in the room understood that the partnership now depended entirely on what happened in the next few minutes. Daniel inhaled slowly, then stepped forward one pace, his voice calm but firm. Miss Monroe, you asked whether my company understands the lesson tonight has provided. Ava watched him quietly. Daniel continued, Caldwell Global was built on innovation, but innovation without accountability means nothing. The room remained silent, listening carefully. He turned slightly toward the crowd of executives, investors, and journalists filling the ballroom, and then looked back at Ava Monroe. Tonight revealed something about leadership that I should have addressed earlier. The words carried across the room clearly, because the microphone near the stage was still live. Daniel gestured toward Victoria. His sister Victoria Caldwell made a decision earlier this evening about who she believed belonged in this room. He paused briefly, then spoke again. That decision was wrong. The sentence landed like a quiet shock. Several guests shifted in their seats while others leaned forward. Ethan Park kept his phone steady, knowing that the story had just entered a completely different stage. Daniel continued, leadership means correcting mistakes publicly when they occur, especially when those mistakes affect the people we claim to respect. He turned slightly again, addressing the entire ballroom. Monroe Group is not simply a partner for Caldwell Global. It is one of the most influential infrastructure organizations in the world. The work Ava Monroe and her team have built over the last 15 years connects industries across continents and has redefined how logistics networks operate. Daniel looked directly at Ava Monroe and said, I should have ensured that the leader of that company was welcomed properly in this room. Ava studied him carefully. Her Expression still calm, but attentive Daniel then did something that surprised nearly everyone present. He stepped away from the stage, entirely moving to stand beside Ava Monroe rather than across from her. The shift in position was subtle, but meaningful. The leader of Caldwell Global was no longer presenting his authority, he was acknowledging someone else's. Victoria Caldwell watched her brother in stunned silence, because she had never seen him change the tone of a room this way. Daniel spoke again, this time addressing his sister. Victoria, tonight you made an assumption about someone's place in this room without knowing who she was or what she had accomplished. Victoria's face flushed slightly as the room's attention turned toward her. Daniel continued, that assumption does not represent the standards our company claims to uphold. Victoria swallowed quietly, then said, I understand. Daniel nodded once, and then looked back at Ava Monroe. The responsibility for that mistake does not belong only to Victoria, it belongs to me, because leadership means building a culture where those assumptions do not happen in the first place. The ballroom remained silent, absorbing every word. Ava Monroe folded her hands calmly in front of her, still listening. Daniel then turned again toward the audience. Tonight, Caldwell Global invited partners, investors, and journalists here to celebrate a future built on collaboration. He paused, then continued, collaboration requires respect, and respect cannot depend on recognition. The sentence carried a quiet authority that caused several guests to nod slowly. Leonard Grayson crossed his arms thoughtfully, clearly impressed by the direction Daniel had taken. The moment Ethan Park zoomed his camera, slightly capturing Ava Monroe's expression as she watched Daniel carefully, because the decision she would make next would still determine the outcome. Daniel spoke again, Miss Monroe, earlier you said that partnerships depend on judgment and trust. Ava nodded slightly. Yes. Daniel continued, tonight my organization failed to demonstrate that trust at the moment it mattered most. Ava remained silent, allowing him to continue. Daniel then did something else that surprised the room. He turned toward the large digital screen behind the stage and gestured to one of the event technicians near the back of the ballroom. Please remove the partnership slide from the screen. The technician hesitated briefly, then pressed a control on the console. The glowing logos of Caldwell Global and Monroe Group faded from the screen, replaced by a neutral background. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd, because the visual symbol of the partnership had just been removed from the room. Daniel turned back toward Ava Monroe and said quietly, that announcement was premature. The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause earlier that evening. Daniel continued, Caldwell Global will not sign any partnership agreement tonight unless Monroe Group believes we deserve the opportunity to earn it. The words settled across the ballroom like a clear line drawn between ambition and accountability. Ava Monroe watched him carefully, the calm intelligence in her gaze revealing nothing about what she was thinking. Victoria Caldwell spoke again, her voice quieter. Now, Ava Monroe, I would like to apologize for the assumption I made earlier tonight. I spoke without understanding who you were or what you have built. Ava looked at her briefly and said, the issue was not that you did not recognize my name. The issue was that recognition determined your judgment. Victoria nodded slowly. I see that now. Daniel spoke again, Miss Monroe, you said earlier that leadership culture determines the future of partnerships. Ava nodded. Yes. Daniel continued, then allow me to demonstrate the culture. I want Caldwell Global to represent. The room listened closely. Daniel gestured toward the crowd. Tonight, every person here saw what happened, and they will remember how we respond to it. Ava remained calm, but attentive. Daniel said quietly, Monroe Group has built a network that connects industries across 3 continents. And Caldwell Global wants to be part of that future. But if tonight showed you that we are not the right partner, then I will respect that decision. The honesty of the statement moved through the room like a quiet current. Ethan Park felt the weight of the moment through the camera lens, because this was the kind of scene that rarely unfolded in public. Corporate leaders admitting mistakes before an audience of investors. Ava Monroe finally spoke, her voice steady and composed. Daniel Caldwell, earlier you asked whether tonight's events would interfere with the future our companies were building. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Ava looked briefly toward the blank screen where the partnership announcement had been displayed only minutes earlier. Then she returned her attention to Daniel. You just made an important decision. Daniel waited. Ava continued, you removed the announcement before the deal was signed. Daniel nodded. That is correct, Ava said calmly. That decision tells me something about your leadership. Daniel remained still, allowing her to finish. Ava Monroe then reached once more into her clutch and removed her phone, the screen lighting softly as she unlocked it. The message from Naomi Brooks, still visible confirmation pending. Ava looked at the phone for a moment and then back at Daniel Caldwell. Every guest in the ballroom understood that the next words she spoke would determine whether the $2.4 billion infrastructure partnership that had dominated the evening's conversation would disappear completely or become something even more powerful than anyone had originally expected. The glow from Ava Monroe's phone screen reflected faintly against the crystal glasses on the nearby table, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to lean toward that small light, as if the future of the evening had narrowed into a single decision held in the palm of her hand. Daniel Caldwell watched without speaking because he understood that every word he had said in the last few minutes had only created the possibility of trust, not the guarantee of it. Around them, hundreds of guests remained silent. Investors who had negotiated mergers worth billions, executives who had led multinational corporations, journalists who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire industries, yet none of them moved, because the decision now belonged entirely to the woman standing calmly in the center of the room. Ava Monroe looked at Daniel for several seconds before speaking, her voice measured and steady. Daniel Caldwell, earlier tonight you made a choice. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Ava continued. You removed the partnership announcement before any agreement had been signed. Daniel answered. That is correct. Ava lifted the phone slightly, as if weighing the significance of the moment in her hand. That decision, she said quietly, demonstrated something important. Daniel waited, because the entire room seemed to pause with him. Ava continued. It demonstrated that you understand the difference between ambition and responsibility. The sentence moved through the ballroom like a soft current. Several guests exchanged glances, realizing that the direction of the evening might still change. Ava looked briefly toward the blank screen where the glowing logos of Monroe Group and Caldwell Global had been only minutes earlier. Then she returned her attention to Daniel Caldwell. When Monroe Group evaluates a partner, we look for two qualities: judgment and accountability. Daniel listened closely. Ava continued. Tonight your organization failed to demonstrate judgment when my presence in this room was questioned, but in the last few minutes you have demonstrated accountability. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing only slightly, because the verdict had not yet arrived. Ava Monroe held his gaze, the faint stain across her white dress still visible under the chandelier light, a quiet reminder of how the evening had begun. Earlier you said that Caldwell Global should earn the opportunity to work with Monroe Group, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes. Ava paused for a moment and then spoke with calm clarity. Earning trust begins with acknowledging the truth of a situation. Daniel remained still. Ava continued. The truth tonight is that if no one in this room had recognized my name, the story would have ended very differently. The words carried quiet authority. Several guests shifted slightly in their seats because they knew the statement was correct. Victoria Caldwell lowered her eyes briefly. Daniel did not argue. He simply nodded because denial would have made the moment worse. Ava looked briefly at the guests surrounding them, investors, executives, and journalists. Then she spoke again. Monroe Group has built its global infrastructure network by choosing partners who understand that leadership cannot depend on appearances. Daniel said quietly. I understand. Ava studied him carefully. Do you? Daniel met her gaze directly. I believe I do now. Ava allowed the faintest hint of a thoughtful smile, the first visible shift in her expression since the confrontation had begun. Ethan Park adjusted his camera slightly, capturing that subtle change because he knew the story was approaching its turning point. Ava looked down at the phone in her hand and tapped the screen. Once Naomi Brooks answered immediately through the speaker. Miss Monroe, the authorization documents are still ready. Ava spoke calmly. Naomi, earlier tonight I asked you to hold the authorization. Naomi replied, yes, Miss Monroe. Ava paused for a moment, the entire ballroom waiting. Then she asked Naomi, have the final partnership agreements been prepared exactly as approved by our legal team? Naomi answered, yes, they are ready for confirmation. Ava lifted her gaze from the phone and looked directly at Daniel Caldwell. Daniel, earlier tonight, you asked whether the events of this evening would interfere with the partnership between our companies. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, Ava said quietly. They did. The room absorbed the statement with absolute stillness. Victoria inhaled sharply. Daniel felt the tension return across the ballroom. Ava continued, however, interference does not always mean destruction. Daniel remained silent, allowing her to continue. Ava Monroe lowered the phone slightly. Monroe Group has spent 6 months preparing to build the infrastructure network we discussed with Caldwell Global. She said the financial investment alone represents one of the largest commitments our company has ever considered. Several investors nodded quietly, understanding the scale of the project. Ava continued, canceling the partnership. Tonight would send a message, Daniel said carefully. What kind of message? Ava answered, the same message that young entrepreneur heard 15 years ago, when someone told her she did not belong in the room. The words settled across the ballroom. With quiet clarity, Daniel recognized the significance. Immediately, Ava Monroe spoke again. Monroe Group does not walk away from opportunities simply because someone underestimated us. Daniel felt a small spark of hope return. Ava continued, instead we redefine the expectations of the room. Leonard Grayson smiled slightly, because the meaning of that sentence was unmistakable. Ava raised the phone again. Naomi, please proceed with the authorization. Naomi replied immediately, yes, Miss Monroe, the confirmation request will be sent now. Ava ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. Daniel Caldwell looked at her in surprise. You are confirming the agreement? Ava met his gaze calmly. Monroe Group will proceed with the partnership. Daniel's shoulders relaxed for the first time in several minutes. But Ava had not finished. She continued, however, the terms of the agreement will change. Daniel listened closely. Ava spoke with the same measured clarity. Monroe Group will continue as the primary infrastructure partner for the global expansion initiative, but Caldwell Global will implement an executive leadership review program across all divisions. Daniel nodded immediately. That is acceptable. Ava continued, the program will focus on leadership, accountability, decision-making culture, and bias awareness within executive management. Daniel said quietly, I understand. Ava added, Monroe Group will also appoint an independent advisory group to monitor the partnership's operational leadership standards. Daniel nodded again, agreed. Ava then looked briefly toward Victoria Caldwell before returning her attention to Daniel. This partnership will move forward not because tonight was perfect, she said, but because tonight revealed exactly why the work ahead matters. Daniel allowed himself a small, respectful nod. The room finally released the breath it had been holding for nearly 20 minutes. A ripple of quiet applause began somewhere near the back of the ballroom, then slowly spread across the crowd. Not the loud celebration that had followed Daniel's earlier announcement, but something deeper, a recognition that something meaningful had just occurred. Ethan Park lowered his phone slightly, realizing he had captured the moment that would define the entire story. Ava Monroe picked up her glass of sparkling water and took a calm sip. Then she said quietly to Daniel Caldwell, partnerships built after difficult conversations are often stronger than the ones announced too early. Daniel nodded with genuine respect. I believe that now. Ava glanced once more toward the stage where the blank screen waited for the next presentation slide. Then she looked back at Daniel and said with quiet certainty, next time you introduce Monroe Group to a room like this, make sure they understand who is already standing in it. The quiet applause that followed Ava Monroe's decision did not sound like celebration. It sounded like relief, the kind that arrives when a room realizes it has narrowly avoided a mistake that could have echoed across the entire business world. Daniel Caldwell stood beside her, absorbing the moment. The tension that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier now slowly dissolving into cautious conversation. The investors, who had remained silent during the confrontation, began whispering again. Executives leaned toward one another, exchanging measured reactions while journalists quietly checked their recordings. Ethan Park lowered his phone for the first time in nearly half an hour, his hands slightly tense from holding the camera steady, but he knew he had captured something rare, not simply a business decision, but a demonstration of leadership in real time. Ava Monroe remained calm beside the table where she had been standing since the evening shifted direction, the faint red stain on her white dress still visible beneath the chandelier light, a quiet reminder of the moment that had started everything. Daniel looked at her again. Miss Monroe, I appreciate the opportunity to move forward with this partnership. Ava nodded slightly. The future of the agreement will depend on the choices made after tonight, Daniel answered. I understand. Victoria Caldwell stood a few feet away watching the exchange, her posture no longer defensive, but thoughtful, the earlier confidence that had carried her across the ballroom replaced by something quieter, reflection. She stepped closer, her voice steady but sincere. Ava Monroe, earlier tonight, I made an assumption about you. Ava turned toward her. Victoria continued, that assumption came from my own limited understanding of what leadership looks like. Ava listened without interruption. Victoria added, I would like the chance to learn from this moment. Ava regarded her carefully, then said something simple, learning from a moment only matters if the lesson changes your next decision. Victoria nodded, slowly, the words landing with clear meaning. Daniel glanced toward the stage where the large screen had been cleared earlier, then back at Ava Monroe. The presentation scheduled for tonight had been designed to celebrate a finished partnership, but the story that unfolded had reshaped the entire event. He spoke quietly. Miss Monroe, the people in this room expected a business announcement tonight. Ava looked around the ballroom, hundreds of guests still watching the two executives at the center of the evening. Yes, she said they did. Daniel continued, then perhaps the announcement should reflect what actually happened. Ava considered his suggestion for a moment. Leonard Grayson stepped slightly closer, clearly curious about how the night would conclude. Ava finally nodded. Very well. Daniel turned toward the stage and signaled to the event technician near the back of the room. The screen behind the podium illuminated again, displaying a simple neutral background. Daniel walked slowly toward the stage, then paused halfway across the ballroom, turning back toward Ava Monroe with a respectful gesture, inviting her to join him. Ava studied the room briefly before stepping forward. The sound of her heels crossing the marble floor carried softly through the quiet ballroom, every guest watching the moment unfold. Daniel waited until she reached the stage, then stepped aside, allowing her to stand beside the podium. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Several investors exchanged impressed glances because it represented a clear acknowledgement of where the authority in the room now rested. Daniel addressed the audience first. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier tonight, I announced a partnership between Caldwell Global and Monroe Group. That announcement was premature because a partnership of this scale requires more than enthusiasm. It requires understanding. He paused, letting the room settle. You have just witnessed a conversation that reminded me and my organization what leadership truly demands. The audience remained silent, listening carefully. Daniel continued, Monroe Group is led by one of the most respected infrastructure strategists in the world, Ava Monroe. He gestured toward her, and the room responded with a wave of genuine applause, not loud or theatrical, but steady, respectful recognition. Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the crowd. Daniel continued, tonight did not unfold as anyone expected, but perhaps that is exactly why it mattered. He stepped back from the podium, allowing Ava Monroe to speak. Ava looked across the ballroom, her gaze moving from table to table. Investors, journalists, entrepreneurs, and executives, all watching her carefully. She spoke calmly. Tonight began as a celebration of a partnership that had not yet been fully understood. She paused. Earlier this evening, I shared a story about attending my first investment conference 15 years ago, when someone assumed I did not belong in the room. Several guests nodded quietly, remembering the moment. She continued, leadership is not defined by how we behave when everyone recognizes us. It is defined by how we respond when someone does not. The sentence carried across the ballroom with quiet authority. Ava continued, Monroe Group builds infrastructure networks that connect industries across continents. But the most important infrastructure in any partnership is trust. She glanced briefly toward Daniel Caldwell, and tonight that trust was tested. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of her words. Ava continued, the partnership between Monroe Group and Caldwell Global will move forward because difficult moments can reveal the strongest opportunities for growth. The audience remained attentive, the room calm but focused. Ava added, however, growth requires accountability, and accountability requires honesty about what happened here tonight. She looked across the ballroom, making direct eye contact with several tables. Assumptions about leadership still exist in rooms like this, assumptions about who belongs and who does not. The sentence hung in the air. Ava continued, those assumptions shape decisions long before contracts are signed. Daniel stood quietly beside her, allowing the message to settle. Ava concluded, tonight was not simply about a business agreement. It was about recognizing that the people who build the future of global infrastructure do not always look the way some expect them to look. The room responded with another wave of respectful applause. Ethan Park raised his phone again, capturing the closing moments, because he knew the speech would become the most quoted part of the story. Ava Monroe stepped away from the podium and turned toward Daniel Caldwell. He extended his hand, and she shook it firmly, the gesture simple, professional, but meaningful, because everyone in the room understood what it represented, the beginning of a partnership built not only on investment, but on a lesson that none of them would forget. The applause inside the ballroom continued longer, this time not loud or theatrical, but steady, the kind of applause that carries respect rather than spectacle. Ava Monroe stepped down from the stage beside Daniel Caldwell and the energy in the room had clearly changed. Conversations returned, but the tone was different, measured, thoughtful, and far more attentive than when the evening began earlier. Many of the investors who had been seated quietly at their tables now stood and moved toward the stage, forming small circles of conversation as they discussed the implications of what had just happened. The partnership between Monroe Group and Caldwell Global was no longer simply another business headline. It had become a lesson unfolding in front of everyone who mattered in that room. Ethan Park moved through the crowd slowly, still recording short clips and taking notes, because he understood that the story he would write later that night would not begin with the announcement Daniel had planned. It would begin with the moment when Ava Monroe stood calmly in the middle of the ballroom and allowed an entire room to recognize what it had almost overlooked. Ava stepped away from the stage and returned toward the table where she had stood earlier, the faint stain on her white dress still visible under the chandelier light. But now no one in the room seemed to notice it as a flaw. If anything, it had become part of the story itself, a reminder of how the night had unfolded. Leonard Grayson approached her first, his expression warm with admiration. "Miss Monroe," he said quietly, "I have attended investment events in this city for more than 30 years, and I cannot remember the last time I saw a moment like that." Ava smiled slightly. "Leadership lessons do not always arrive in boardrooms." Leonard nodded thoughtfully. "That is certainly true." Several other executives approached, offering brief introductions and congratulations, some of them apologizing indirectly for the earlier misunderstanding, while others simply expressed respect for how she had handled the situation. Ava acknowledged each of them with the same calm professionalism that had defined her presence all evening across the ballroom. Daniel Caldwell spoke quietly with several members of his executive team, explaining the adjustments that would be made to the partnership agreement and the leadership review program. He had promised earlier the conversations were serious, but not tense. If anything, they carried a renewed focus, because everyone understood that the agreement moving forward would now be stronger, precisely because it had been challenged before it was finalized. Victoria Caldwell stood near the edge of the stage, watching the room slowly return to life. The earlier confidence she had carried at the beginning of the evening replaced by a quiet determination. She finally walked toward Ava Monroe, who was speaking with Leonard Grayson and two infrastructure investors from Texas. Victoria waited politely until the conversation ended, then addressed Ava directly. "Miss Monroe." Ava turned toward her. "Yes." Victoria took a small breath. "Earlier tonight I apologize for the assumption I made." Ava nodded. "I remember." Victoria continued, "but an apology does not erase the impact of that assumption." Ava studied her carefully, listening. Victoria added, "I want you to know that I will personally ensure the leadership program you required becomes more than a formality." Ava tilted her head slightly. "What does that mean?" Victoria answered, "It means that the first session will be led by someone who understands the experience you described earlier." Ava raised an eyebrow slightly. Victoria continued, "I want the executives in my organization to hear that story directly from you, if you are willing to tell it." Ava considered the request for a moment, then said quietly, "Stories matter when they change the way people make decisions." Victoria nodded. "That is exactly why I am asking." Ava allowed a small, thoughtful smile. "Then we will discuss it." Victoria thanked her and stepped away, looking far more reflective than she had at the beginning of the evening. Ethan Park approached cautiously, holding his phone but lowering it respectfully. "Miss Monroe, may I ask one question?" Ava looked at him. "Go ahead." Ethan said, "Tonight could have ended very differently. Many executives might have simply walked away from the partnership. Why did you decide to continue?" Ava paused for a moment, considering the question. The nearby guests leaned slightly closer, listening. She finally answered, "Because walking away would have proven the same assumption." "Correct." Ethan frowned slightly, not fully understanding. Ava explained, "If someone believes you do not belong in the room, and you leave, then they never learn why they were wrong." Ethan nodded slowly, realizing the deeper meaning of her answer. Across the ballroom, Daniel Caldwell approached them again, his expression calmer than earlier, but still thoughtful. "Miss Monroe, the revised partnership documentation will be sent to your office within the hour." Ava nodded. "Naomi will review it." Daniel continued, "I also wanted to thank you again for the opportunity to correct what happened tonight." Ava looked around the ballroom at the conversations taking place, the executives who had witnessed the entire exchange, the journalists already preparing their reports, and the investors who now understood the significance of the leadership review program. She said quietly, "The important part is not correcting what happened tonight." Daniel listened closely. Ava continued, "The important part is making sure the same mistake does not happen again." Daniel nodded. I intend to ensure that Ava reached for her glass of sparkling water which had been placed back on the table earlier, and took a small sip. The room around them had returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere was different, more attentive, more aware. Daniel looked toward the stage where the screen now displayed a simple message thanking guests for attending the Caldwell Foundation event earlier tonight. He said, "I believe the most important moment of this evening would be announcing a partnership." Ava smiled slightly, and now Daniel finished. "Now, I realized the most important moment was understanding why the partnership matters." Ava nodded. "The future of infrastructure depends on the people who decide who gets to build it." Daniel looked across the ballroom, where investors from several continents were now discussing the implications of the new leadership program. "I suspect many people in this room will remember tonight for a long time." Ava answered, "That is not a bad thing sometimes. The most valuable investment is the lesson that prevents the next mistake." Daniel allowed himself a quiet smile. "Then tonight may turn out to be the most valuable investment our company has ever made." Ava placed her glass back on the table and glanced toward the tall windows of the ballroom, where the lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass. The city outside moved forward, as it always did, taxis passing beneath streetlights, office towers glowing against the dark sky. The world did not pause for moments like this, but inside that ballroom the people who shaped industries had just witnessed something they would not easily forget, a reminder that leadership was not defined by titles, introductions, or assumptions. It was defined by the choices people made. When the room finally realized who had been standing there all along, the ballroom slowly settled into a quieter rhythm as the final conversations of the evening unfolded beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. The earlier tension that had filled the room now transformed into something deeper: reflection, curiosity, and respect. Ava Monroe stood near the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, the city lights stretching across the skyline like a living network of energy far beyond the walls of the Waldorf Astoria. The faint mark on her white dress remained visible, yet no one who approached her saw it as a stain anymore. If anything, it had become a symbol of the moment that had shifted the direction of the night. Daniel Caldwell stood a few feet away, speaking with members of his executive team, outlining the steps that would follow the leadership program, the advisory oversight, the revised partnership structure, everything that would now shape the collaboration between Caldwell Global and Monroe Group. When he finished speaking, he walked toward Ava again, his expression thoughtful but steady. "Miss Monroe," he said quietly, "tonight did not unfold the way any of us expected." Ava looked out toward the glowing city for a moment before turning back toward him. "Moments that matter rarely do." Daniel nodded slowly. "You were right earlier when you said leadership is defined by the choices we make when we do not recognize the person standing in front of us." Ava allowed a faint smile. "The room tonight learned that lesson." Daniel glanced around the ballroom, where guests were preparing to leave, some still speaking quietly about the conversation they had witnessed, others exchanging contact information and discussing the implications of the new partnership structure. "I suspect that by tomorrow morning the entire business press will be talking about what happened here," Ava answered calmly. "Then perhaps they will also talk about what was learned." Daniel gave a small respectful nod. Across the room, Ethan Park stood near one of the marble columns, typing notes quickly into his phone, his mind already shaping the story that would appear in the morning edition. He knew exactly how he would begin, not with the announcement of a $2.4 billion infrastructure agreement, but with the moment when a quiet woman stood in the center of a ballroom and allowed a room full of powerful people to recognize the assumptions they had almost allowed to define the night. Leonard Grayson approached Ava once more before leaving. "Miss Monroe," he said warmly, "I have seen many deals announced in rooms like this, but tonight reminded me that the most important deals are not the ones written on paper, they are the ones that change the way people think." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Change is the only infrastructure that truly lasts." Leonard smiled at that answer, then shook her hand and walked toward the exit, joining the steady flow of guests leaving the ballroom. Victoria Caldwell remained near the stage, watching the last conversations fade, her posture very different from the confident entrance she had made earlier in the evening. She finally walked toward Ava Monroe once more. "Miss Monroe." Ava turned toward her. Victoria spoke quietly. "Tonight will stay with me for a long time." Ava answered, "That depends on what you do with the memory." Victoria nodded slowly. "I intend to make sure that the leadership program we discussed becomes part of our company culture, not just a policy on paper." Ava studied her expression and saw something genuine there, determination shaped by humility. Then she said softly, "That would Make tonight worthwhile. Victoria offered a respectful nod before leaving the ballroom. Daniel Caldwell joined Ava near the windows again. The room, now half empty, the staff beginning to collect glasses and fold table linens, the orchestra packing away their instruments after a performance no one had expected. Daniel looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. Manhattan never slows down, he said. Ava followed his gaze, the city lights reflecting softly in the window. It should not progress depends on movement. Daniel paused for a moment before speaking again. Earlier tonight, when you stood in the middle of the room and said that recognition should not determine respect, I realized something. Ava waited. He continued, for years, I believed leadership meant being the person everyone recognized. But tonight showed me that real leadership often walks into the room without announcing itself. Ava nodded quietly. That is why the most important question is never who someone is. The most important question is how we treat them before we know. Daniel let the words settle between them. He extended his hand once more, and Ava shook it. The agreement between their companies now stronger than the one he had tried to celebrate earlier, not because it had been perfect, but because it had been tested and reshaped by a moment of honesty. Across the ballroom, Ethan Park captured one final photograph. Ava Monroe standing near the window overlooking the city, a calm presence at the center of a story that would travel far beyond that room. The next morning, headlines would speak about the partnership between Monroe Group and Caldwell Global, about the leadership program and the revised agreement. But the people who had been inside that ballroom would remember something else, the quiet lesson that unfolded before the contracts were signed, a reminder that influence does not always arrive with introductions. Power does not always announce itself, and sometimes the person a room underestimates is the one who ultimately defines the future everyone else came to celebrate.